Ramesses III, the last great pharaoh of Egypt, didn't just kill people. He was a cannibal of souls, and the women who dared to challenge him weren't just executed. They were fed, while still breathing, into the grinding gears of Oblivion. Forget a fair trial and a quick death. The punishment he invented for them was the slow, public amputation of their very existence. Right now, transport yourself to the epicenter of this rot. Picture not a quiet courtroom, but the deafening, furious scrape of metal on stone under a blistering sun. The rough hands of a soldier, not a scribe, strike a hammer against a chisel, again and again, blasting sacred hieroglyphs from a polished temple wall. A name, a title. Every line, now just stone dust, was once the life of the woman who bore that name. Now, imagine her, the former queen, dragged there and forced to watch it. Every hammer blow is a whip strike against her very soul. The air is thick with the smell of stone dust, sweat, and concentrated, absolute humiliation. She is still breathing, but she is already gone. She is a living ghost, witnessing her own erasure from reality. This is the justice of Ramesses. Not a quick death from a blade, but the slow, sadistic agony of total annihilation. And now, step back from this abomination and look at the glittering lie you've been fed for centuries. Look at his monumental mortuary temple at Medinet Habu. Endless reliefs celebrating him as a warrior god, crushing the enemies of Egypt. Pious scenes of him making offerings to the gods, upholding Ma'at, cosmic order and justice. What a disgusting, cynical comedy. All of this propaganda is just cheap wallpaper pasted over a mass grave where not bodies, but memories themselves are buried. The official history isn't just a mistake. It is a cowardly, deliberate cover-up of a crime so monstrous it had to be not just buried, but carved out of the fabric of time itself. But this ritual of soul destruction wasn't just the whim of a single monster in the throes of power. It was the symptom of a disease that had rotted his entire great empire to its very core. So how did they build this perfect machine for murdering memory? And what specific rotting secret was Ramesses so desperately trying to hide? The answer is even filthier than you can imagine. To understand this abomination, you have to look past the golden masks and meet the monsters who made it happen. First, there is Ramesses himself. Forget the heroic statues. See him for what he was, an aging king, his body failing, his grip on power slipping. He was a man drowning in a sea of his own offspring, with dozens of sons from a sprawling harem of secondary wives, each one a potential rival, each wife a potential conspirator. His kingdom wasn't a divinely ordered paradise. It was a pressure cooker of ambition, and he was sitting on the lid, terrified of the day it would inevitably explode. He wasn't a god king. He was a warden, and his primary job was managing the vipers he kept in his own nest. Then there is the architect of the plot, Queen T. Don't mistake her for a simple villain. She was a product of the very system that would later destroy her. A secondary wife, a beautiful piece of royal property whose only purpose was to produce a male heir. Her son, Pentower, was a prince, yes, but he was far down the line of succession. Tia was a prisoner in a gilded cage, watching her son's birthright fade with every passing year as the sons of the great royal wife were pushed to the forefront. Was her conspiracy born of pure evil? Or was it the desperate final scream of a woman who knew the system was designed to discard her and her child like trash? In this world, you were either a predator or prey. Tia chose to be a predator. And let us not forget the jackals who fed on the chaos. The butlers, the scribes, the harem officials, the military commanders who joined the plot. They weren't revolutionaries fighting for a cause. They were rats gnawing at the foundations of power, driven by greed and petty grievance, promised land, gold, and women if the coup succeeded. They saw a paranoid king and a desperate queen and smelled an opportunity. These were the gears in the machine, soulless, self-serving cowards who would pledge allegiance to any monster that promised them a bigger piece of the carcass. But these individual actors, with their pathetic appetites and fears, were just symptoms of the disease. The real monster was the institution of the royal harem itself, a political weapon designed to breed heirs and neutralize threats, all under the guise of royal splendor. It was a snake pit disguised as a garden. So what happens when that weapon backfires? What happens when the paranoia used to control the system infects its master? That is when the whispers turn to plots, and the palace becomes a slaughterhouse. How did Ramesses get away with a crime against reality itself? He didn't have to build a new machine of terror. He just had to turn the ignition key on the one that was already there. The entire Egyptian state, its courts, its priesthood, its bureaucracy, was an engine built for one purpose: to affirm the absolute, divine, and infallible power of the Pharaoh. Justice wasn't about truth. It was about reinforcing the king's authority. Mayat wasn't a principle. It was a brand name for royal power, and Ramesses was about to use that brand to sanctify his depraved vengeance. The trial of the Harem conspirators, as documented in the judicial papyrus of Turin, is hailed by some historians as a shining example of Egyptian legal process. What a sickening lie. It was a show trial from start to finish. Ramesses hand-selected a commission of 12 judges, gave them a direct order. As for the charges, "It is you who shall examine them," and then stepped back. This wasn't a delegation of justice. It was a demand for the correct verdict. He was laundering his revenge through a corrupt bureaucracy, giving it the stench of legitimacy. And the judges, eager to please their paranoid master, dutifully delivered the heads he wanted. The trial wasn't a process of discovery. It was a ritual of condemnation. But the filth runs so much deeper. The system wasn't just politically corrupt. It was personally degenerate. During this great legal proceeding, a dark little secret emerged. Several of the very judges Ramesses had appointed to condemn the conspirators were caught having an orgy with the accused women. Let that sink in. The men tasked with upholding the divine order were celebrating with the traitors behind closed doors. The entire affair was rotten to the core. It was a circus of hypocrisy, where the arbiters of justice were no better than the criminals they were sentencing. This wasn't a court of law. It was a den of vipers, all fighting over the same scraps of power and pleasure, with the Pharaoh as the chief viper. They had built a perfect, self-sustaining engine of filth, where loyalty was purchased, justice was for sale, and the law was nothing more than the king's whim written on papyrus. But every machine, when pushed to its limit, either breaks down or explodes. And an explosion was coming, an event so vile it would make everything before it look like child's play. This was the day the mask of civilization was not just removed, but smashed on the floor and ground into dust. The verdicts came down, and with them, a new vocabulary of cruelty was introduced into the Egyptian state. This was the moment Ramesses declared that the laws of gods and men no longer applied to him. He was no longer a king. He had become a plague. The point of no return wasn't the discovery of the plot. It was the nature of the punishment. It was a conscious step into an abyss of tyranny from which there would be no escape. For the men, the sentences were brutal but familiar. The high-ranking officials were executed. Their bodies were likely thrown into the Nile, unceremoniously, denying them a proper burial and threatening their journey to the afterlife. A lesser tier of conspirators, including Prince Pentower, were granted a final, twisted mercy. They were found guilty and then left alone in a room to take their own lives. This was not an act of compassion. It was a calculated act of damnation, forcing them to be the instruments of their own destruction and staining their deaths with the dishonor of suicide. It was efficient. It was clean, and it served as a terrifying warning. But for the women, death was too good. It was too simple, too final. Ramesses needed something more. He needed to punish them in this world and the next. This is where his vengeance became truly pathological. He decreed through his puppet court that the conspirators who were executed would have their names officially changed. Powerful court officials were posthumously renamed Mesed-su-Re, meaning Ra hates him. But the most insidious punishment was reserved for the women. The records are chillingly silent on their specific fates, but it's the erasure that speaks volumes. For them, there would be no new name. There would be no name at all. They were sentenced to become nothing, anonymity, oblivion. They had crossed the line. The pact with the devil was signed in blood and sealed with the scraping of a chisel. They had sentenced these people not just to death, but to an eternity of being forgotten. But destroying the public record was one thing. What Ramesses planned for the women in the suffocating silence of the harem, away from the prying eyes of any scribe, was his true masterpiece of cruelty. This was where justice died, and the true horror began. Now, plunge into the darkness. There are no papyrus records for this part of the story, because what happened next was never meant to be recorded. It was meant to be felt. The true climax of Ramesses' revenge wasn't a swift execution. It was a slow, grinding psychological demolition. Imagine Queen Taye and the other women of the conspiracy, dragged from their lavish apartments. They are not killed. They are stripped. Stripped of their titles. Stripped of their fine linen. Stripped of their servants. Stripped of their jewelry. And most importantly, stripped of their names. From this moment on, it is forbidden to speak their names. It is forbidden to write them. They are no longer royal wife or lady of the court. They are simply nothing. Can you comprehend the sheer, mind-breaking horror of this? For an ancient Egyptian, your name, your Ren, was your anchor to existence. It was the magic that would be spoken by your descendants to give you life after death. Without a name, you could not pass into the afterlife. You were doomed to be devoured by the cosmic monster Ammit. Ramesses didn't just kill these women. He murdered their immortal souls, and he forced them to be alive to witness it. Every day they would wake up within the very palace walls that once celebrated them, now living as ghosts. They would see the scribes systematically chiseling their images and cartouches from the temple walls, replacing them with smooth, blank stone. They were forced to watch their own eradication from history, one painful chip of limestone at a time. Imagine the stench of this existence, living in squalor, perhaps in the most remote, lightless corner of the harem complex. Ignored by the very servants who once trembled before them. They were walking corpses, breathing reminders of the Pharaoh's ultimate power. Their children, if they weren't executed, were taken from them, their own identities likely erased as well. Every breath they took was a testament to their damnation. They were not allowed the peace of death, only the endless agony of being a forgotten thing. This is what is worse than death. It is the conscious experience of your own annihilation. It is the torment of watching the world conspire to pretend you were never born, while your heart is still, horrifically, beating in your chest. And when the carnage of erasure was over, a terrible silence fell upon the harem, the silence of absolute fear. But in that silence, a new horror was born, the official lie, the desperate, pathetic attempt to bury the ghosts and rewrite the story. But you cannot bury the truth, and the truth that crawled out of that living grave was even more monstrous than the plot itself. Every monster fears the dawn. And while Ramesses III believed his victory was absolute, a bleak dawn was indeed coming for the kingdom he had poisoned with his own paranoia. His reign did not usher in a new golden age. It was the beginning of the end. Though he survived the initial assassination attempt long enough to pass his horrific judgments, it is highly likely that the assassins ultimately succeeded, his throat cut deep. He died not as a triumphant god, but as a butchered man, and with him died the last embers of the new kingdom's glory. The economic rot, the institutional corruption, and the social decay he had papered over with his war monuments and show trials all erupted after his death, sending Egypt into a spiral of decline from which it would never truly recover. And what of justice? There was none. The system, that great engine of corruption, protected its own. The judges who were caught in orgies with the condemned prisoners. They weren't executed. They were just berated and dismissed. A slap on the wrist for a crime that revealed the utter moral bankruptcy of the state. Ramesses was buried with all the pomp and splendor of a god in the Valley of the Kings, his mummy adorned with spells and his tomb filled with treasure to ensure his own eternal life, the very thing he so sadistically stole from his victims. The official narrative was cemented in stone. A great king had vanquished traitors and preserved order. The lie was complete. In the end, Ramesses' empire of filth crumbled into dust. But his legacy? His legacy is a poison that still seeps into the ground we walk on. He perfected a timeless strategy of tyrannical power. It is not enough to simply eliminate your enemies. To truly win, you must erase their story. You must silence their voices so completely that future generations don't even know there was a story to tell. This brutal act of unpersoning, of memory-holding dissent, has been the favorite tool of despots for the 3,000 years that have followed. They learned the lesson written in the blood and silence of Ramesses' court. They taught the world a lesson, not about justice, but about how much evil humanity will tolerate and even celebrate in the name of stability and power. And if you think their time is over, if you think we've learned anything at all about the monsters who write our histories, you simply haven't been paying attention.